October 1944, 6:47 a.m., Kemp Park, just west of London. The ground, still damp from the previous night's rain, shimmers under the grey morning light. A transport lorry rumbles over the gravel, its tires crunching loudly against the wet earth. The engine dies with a throaty cough. 32 men, each stiff-legged and weary, disembark one by one, their hands bound with rough canvas strips. Their faces are set in expressions of exhaustion and uncertainty. Feldwebel Hans Müller, a 23-year-old captured in Normandy just 3 days earlier, stares blankly ahead, eyes scanning the camp's barbed wire perimeter. He braces himself for what he believes awaits: the dogs, the batons, the brutal treatment he has been promised in the German propaganda. He expects a ruthless British enemy, a cold island of vengeance where men like him are left to rot. But instead, a British sergeant steps forward, clipboard in hand. His face is neutral, his manner unhurried. The sergeant looks at Müller, then at the line of men. "Tea," he says, without ceremony, "while we sort the paperwork. You've had a long ride." Müller watches in disbelief as the sergeant pours hot tea into a tin cup, steam rising into the cold air. He offers it to the first man in line. No dogs, no batons, just a cup of tea. The men stand still, unsure. They wait for the trick, but it doesn't come. Context, here's background, Section 1, the year is 1944. The Second World War, now in its 5th year, has consumed Europe, leaving entire cities in ruins and altering the very fabric of society. On the Western Front, the Allied forces have gained significant momentum. The D-Day landings in June marked a turning point, and by October, the Allied forces were steadily pushing eastward, having liberated much of France. But for the German soldiers on the front lines, the tide of war was unmistakably turning against them. For these soldiers, there was an unspoken promise: surrender to the Allies, and you would be treated with cruelty. The Nazis had perpetuated a message that British captivity meant suffering, starvation, brutal treatment, forced marches, and worse. The German propaganda machine had painted the Allies as merciless enemies, whose POW camps were places of horror. Surrender, it was said, was a death sentence. Müller, like most of his comrades, believed this to be the truth. And so, as the Allies advanced across France, the fear of being captured became a reality worse than death itself. For years, the Nazis had glorified the idea of the fighting soldier who would go down with honor, die for the Führer, and never yield. It was a system of ideals that many men, like Müller, had internalized from a young age. And yet, in the cold morning of October 1944, he found himself bound by canvas straps, standing in a British POW camp, face to face with the very system he had been told to fear. The reality of British POW treatment was far from what he had been warned about. The Geneva Conventions, signed by numerous nations, outlined the minimum standards for humane treatment of prisoners of war. Germany had signed this document, though it had been repeatedly violated, particularly when it came to Soviet prisoners. But the British, despite the brutal nature of the war they were fighting, adhered strictly to the Geneva Conventions. The British POW camps were notorious for their relatively humane conditions, a stark contrast to the death camps Müller and others had feared. In these camps, prisoners were not just numbers or statistics. They were individuals whose basic needs were met and whose rights were respected, at least within the bounds of wartime necessity. Britain's POW policy was driven by the pragmatic realization that a stable, humane system for prisoners would reduce unrest and escape attempts. It would also allow for the collection of valuable intelligence, while maintaining a sense of decency that reflected Britain's commitment to the rule of law, even in the chaos of war. The British had learned from the mistakes of previous wars, and while they maintained a strict security policy, they were determined to uphold a standard of dignity for their prisoners. Unlike the Germans, who used POW camps as a means of punishment, Britain's approach was grounded in the principle of reciprocity, treating prisoners well in the hope that enemy forces would do the same with British captives. This was not charity. It was a strategic calculation. Müller, like many German soldiers, had expected the worst. It was difficult for him to reconcile the British treatment of prisoners with what he had been taught. To him, the British were the enemy, the ruthless force that had invaded his homeland and now stood on the edge of victory. How could they treat him with any form of dignity? This was not the enemy he had been promised. As the war raged on, the Allied powers, especially Britain, faced a growing number of prisoners. The system they devised to manage these men, particularly in the later years of the war, became a testament to their adherence to the Geneva Conventions. Unlike the German treatment of Allied POWs, which had often been brutal and neglectful, Britain's approach stood out as a relatively humane model in a war that had seen unimaginable cruelty. Britain had long understood that victory in warfare wasn't solely defined by battlefield triumphs, but by the ability to uphold principles even when faced with the most brutal of enemies. The British Army and its leadership, in particular, were guided by the philosophy of moral high ground. The treatment of prisoners was viewed as an opportunity to maintain this higher standard, ensuring that they could hold their heads high even as the war neared its conclusion. This was not simply a matter of goodwill, it was the result of a carefully constructed policy, reinforced through repeated directives from the British War Office. The Geneva Conventions, signed in 1929, had outlined clear guidelines for the treatment of prisoners of war. For Britain, this was not just a document to follow for international appearances, but a core principle embedded in military doctrine. British POW camps operated under strict regulations. Food rations for the prisoners met or often exceeded the minimum caloric intake required by the convention, usually around 2,800 to 3,000 calories per day. While it wasn't a luxurious diet, it ensured the prisoners remained healthy and fit for work, which was a key factor in maintaining morale and order at camps. The medical treatment was another crucial aspect of the British POW system. Medical care in British camps was surprisingly good, especially when compared to the conditions in the German camps, where prisoners often faced neglect or even deadly medical experiments. In British camps, prisoners received regular checkups, vaccines, and even treatments for illnesses like tuberculosis. For the prisoners, this care was a revelation. They had been conditioned to believe that the Allies would treat them as subhuman, but instead, they encountered an entirely different reality. In addition to physical care, the psychological and emotional well-being of the prisoners was also a concern for the British authorities. Although the war itself created immense stress, the British leadership knew that creating an environment of stability, fairness, and discipline would help prevent unrest and facilitate cooperation from the prisoners. It was this stability that Müller would come to experience firsthand, despite the great initial resistance in his mind. It wasn't simply a matter of feeding and clothing the prisoners. It was about providing them with a structured, orderly environment that would reduce the chances of escape attempts or rebellion. Prisoners who behaved in accordance with camp rules were allowed to participate in activities like reading, arts and crafts, and even education programs. These small freedoms helped the prisoners maintain a sense of agency, which was especially important during such a disorienting and traumatic time. In contrast to what Müller had expected, there was no overt malice, no cruel treatment, only a system that sought to create order even within the chaos of war. There was a marked difference between the treatment of prisoners in German-controlled areas and the British camps. In many German POW camps, especially those in Eastern Europe, prisoners faced near starvation, disease, and forced labor under horrendous conditions. In contrast, Britain adhered to a system that, while austere, was fair. The reason behind this difference was not just moral, but also strategic. British leadership understood that maintaining the dignity of their prisoners not only avoided negative publicity, but also undermined the Nazi regime's propaganda. The Germans had made claims that Britain, along with the Allies, would treat their prisoners poorly. This was a tool of psychological warfare designed to discourage surrender. But by adhering to the Geneva Conventions, the British created a paradox. They undermined the German narrative and, in doing so, created a sense of confusion among German soldiers like Müller. As the war continued to unfold, more and more German soldiers began to surrender to the Allies. Whether this was because of battlefield conditions or a growing realization that their side would not win, many began to question the ideas they had been fed. The sight of British POW camps, where the prisoners were treated as men, not as cattle, was an eye-opener for many. And, for soldiers like Müller, the emotional dissonance between the propaganda they had been taught and the reality they now faced in British captivity created a profound shift in how they viewed the Allies. In the winter of 1944, this policy of humane treatment was put to the test as thousands of German soldiers were captured during the Allies' drive into the heart of Western Europe. Yet even with the rise in the number of prisoners, the British maintained their standards. The POW system that had been created was efficient, bureaucratic, and, most importantly, consistent. For Müller, this new world was almost unrecognizable. The promises of brutal retribution, the images of starving, beaten men that had haunted him from German leaflets, all started to lose their credibility. In his own mind, he was a prisoner caught in a system he could no longer fully understand, one where he had not just survived, but found unexpected humanity. Feldwebel Hans Müller had been a soldier for most of his adult life. The war had defined him. It was the backdrop of his youth, the framework of his sense of purpose. Like many others, he had been swept up in the fervor of nationalism, indoctrinated by a regime that promised both victory and vengeance. The rhetoric of Nazi propaganda had taught him that to surrender was to lose everything, to be dishonored, to be humiliated, to die slowly in enemy hands. The idea of British captivity was an image of suffering, starvation, torture, and an end to dignity. But here, in a British POW camp, Müller's expectations began to unravel. The camp, though austere, was not the nightmarish vision he had been warned about. The initial shock of the sergeant's kindness, the tea, was the first sign of a different reality. Müller's mind, trained to perceive the Allies as enemies with no moral compass, struggled to comprehend the treatment he was receiving. The sergeant had offered him tea as though they were equals, not captor and prisoner. It was an unsettling moment, one that would be the first of many. Throughout his first days in captivity, Müller found himself confused by the behavior of the British officers and soldiers. They spoke to him in calm, neutral tones, not with the derision he had expected. The medical officers conducted thorough exams with no hint of cruelty. The processing was efficient, almost impersonal, but with a basic level of respect that Müller had never anticipated. He found himself wondering, was this an act? Was this a carefully crafted illusion to break the spirit of the German soldier, to soften them for interrogation? But the more he observed, the more he realized this was no act. British treatment of POWs was not based on subterfuge or cruelty. It was grounded in something different, something practical. Their treatment wasn't about subjugation, punishment. It was about stability, order, and maintaining the higher moral ground. For the first time in the war, Müller was being treated like a man, not just a soldier. And for someone raised on the belief that all enemies were subhuman, this was an unsettling, almost incomprehensible realization. As the weeks passed and Müller adjusted to his new life, the emotional dissonance grew. The small acts of kindness, like the medical officer's care or the offer of food and tea, began to chip away at his deeply ingrained perceptions of the British. The camp's infrastructure, designed to maintain order, prevented unrest. But there was more at play here than just order. There was respect, and slowly, Müller found himself questioning everything he had been taught. Could it be that the enemy, in whom he had placed so much hate and fear, was not what he had been told? This shift in perspective was slow and subtle, but it began to grow stronger with each passing day. The contrast between his treatment in British captivity and the stories of German POWs in Soviet hands, where starvation, disease, and brutality were common, became impossible to ignore. The German army had promised that the Allies would treat him as a beast. But here, in Britain, Müller had begun to see that he had been lied to. The British POW system was more than just a humanitarian effort. It was a carefully crafted strategy that played into broader wartime tactics. The leadership knew that they would be holding prisoners for years, potentially hundreds of thousands. And the system they developed reflected not only an adherence to the Geneva Conventions, but also an understanding of the broader implications of prisoner treatment in shaping the course of the war. By adhering to international law, Britain was able to maintain the moral high ground, which was increasingly valuable in the eyes of both the civilian population and the global community. As the war entered its final stages, propaganda was no longer just about defeating the enemy on the battlefield. It was about ensuring that the reputation of the Allies remained intact. The British leadership understood the power of propaganda and knew that their treatment of prisoners would influence German morale. For German soldiers like Müller, seeing that their comrades in captivity were being treated humanely could lead to a breakdown in the Nazi regime's carefully constructed narrative of Allied brutality. This was not to say that Britain's treatment of POWs was perfect. It was a war, after all, and the situation was fraught with complexity. There were still instances of poor condition, overcrowding, harsh weather, and periods of limited rations. Yet, compared to other theaters of the war, the British treatment of POWs stood in sharp contrast. While other nations, including the Soviet Union and Japan, were infamous for their inhumane treatment of prisoners, Britain worked to strike a balance between maintaining order and observing humanitarian standards. The British approach to POWs was also highly tactical. The goal was not just to keep the prisoners alive, but to keep them healthy enough to work. In many camps, prisoners were used for labor, which provided the Allies with valuable resources and helped maintain the morale of the civilian population. For Miller and other prisoners like him, this meant being assigned to work details, often in farms, factories, or construction sites, where they were put to productive use. The work was hard, but within Geneva Convention limits. Miller was assigned to a farm in Somerset, where he worked long hours mucking stalls, repairing fences, and hauling hay bales. But the British did not simply use the prisoners as forced labor. They also created an environment that allowed for the possibility of trust and cooperation. This trust was not given lightly, but earned through consistent behavior. The British camp officials had a clear understanding of human nature. They knew that prisoners who were treated with dignity were less likely to revolt and more likely to be cooperative. The camps were designed with the understanding that work, when framed as a mutual contract, could foster a sense of respect and accountability. The policy of reciprocity extended beyond the prisoner-camp-guard relationship. It also played into Britain's broader diplomatic strategy. The Allies knew that capturing German soldiers was not just a military victory, it was a psychological victory as well. The Germans had made certain promises to their soldiers, promises of victory, of honor, and of a glorious Reich. But when those soldiers were taken prisoner by the British, they encountered a different reality, one where they were treated with respect, where their basic needs were met, and where they had some degree of autonomy. This realization had the potential to break the Nazi propaganda machine from the inside out. For Müller and his comrades, the dawning realization that the British were holding to international law and treating them according to the standards of the Geneva Conventions undermined the Nazi propaganda they had grown up with. What began as a slow shift in perception soon turned into a deeper understanding. Müller's experience in captivity wasn't just a change in how he viewed the British. It was a reflection of the broader impact Britain's treatment of POWs would have on the war's psychological and tactical dimensions. The system wasn't perfect, but it worked. British POW camps, built on the foundation of order, decency, and respect, served not only as a place of temporary confinement, but as a counterpoint to the atrocities happening elsewhere in the war. As more German soldiers, like Müller, passed through these camps, the image of the British soldier, once painted as an enemy to be feared, began to transform into something else entirely. At the heart of Britain's POW system was a clear and steadfast leadership vision, one that was not only morally grounded but politically calculated. British military leaders understood that the way they treated prisoners of war could have far-reaching consequences, influencing both the course of the war and post-war diplomacy. The principles laid out by the British War Office were deliberate and pragmatic: security, intelligence, diplomacy, and, lastly, morality. While the first three were seen as essential to the war effort, the final pillar, morality, was no less important. British officers, especially those tasked with overseeing POW camps, were trained to adhere to these principles with an almost bureaucratic efficiency. The directives from the War Office were clear. Prisoners were to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, not as enemies to be punished, but as soldiers who had fallen on the wrong side of a conflict. This was a matter of discipline, not charity. Treating prisoners with dignity wasn't just the right thing to do, it was a matter of national integrity and, ultimately, military strategy. The leadership's commitment to humane treatment was reinforced by practical necessity. The more orderly and well-treated the prisoners were, the fewer escape attempts and instances of unrest occurred within the camps. By maintaining a structured and disciplined environment, British authorities ensured that the POWs could be managed effectively, without resorting to brutality. There were no random beatings or public executions. Instead, the punishment for misconduct was a regulated system of solitary confinement. If a prisoner misbehaved, they were isolated but not tortured. The emphasis on restraint was clear. From a diplomatic standpoint, Britain's treatment of POWs served as a stark contrast to that of the German military. Nazi ideology, with its glorification of conquest and dominance, viewed prisoners of war as disposable objects to be exploited or eliminated. This cruelty was reflected in the treatment of Soviet prisoners, where starvation, disease, and mass executions were commonplace. The German leadership had long used their treatment of POWs as a tool of psychological warfare, a way to dehumanize the enemy and sow fear among their own troops. But when British soldiers took prisoners, they acted in a way that disrupted this narrative. They followed the letter of international law, not just for appearances, but because it served Britain's strategic interests. The British command understood that by treating German soldiers according to international law, they would diminish the impact of Nazi propaganda. Each prisoner who entered a British camp carried with them the potential to question the narrative they had been told about the Allies. For many, like Müller, this led to a gradual unraveling of the dehumanizing beliefs they had been taught. The lessons of decency, consistency, and restraint would begin to take root. Beyond the strategic implications, British leadership in these camps was also influenced by a sense of duty to uphold a broader vision of civilization. The camp commandants, the officers, and the medical staff all adhered to the belief that their actions, though bound by the harsh realities of war, could help preserve the values of decency, fairness, and respect. They weren't just fighting a military campaign. They were safeguarding the principles that defined British society, even in the darkest days of conflict. This approach to leadership, which balanced strict adherence to military rules with a commitment to humanity, had profound implications for both the soldiers and the civilian population. Prisoners who were treated with respect were more likely to cooperate with their captors, offering valuable intelligence and lessening the burden of internal strife in the camps. But perhaps more importantly, it allowed the British to retain their dignity in the face of total war. For Müller, the steady application of these principles would become the defining experience of his captivity. In the British camp, he saw firsthand how leadership, grounded in moral restraint and strategic discipline, created a space where prisoners were not only held physically, but were allowed to retain a sense of agency. His relationship with his captors, particularly the farmer in Somerset, began to reflect this evolution in leadership. The farmer, Dalton, treated him as a laborer first, not a prisoner. He trusted Müller with work and responsibility, which deepened the bond of mutual respect between them. Over time, that respect would evolve into something more profound, a shared understanding of the importance of trust. Even in wartime, the decisive moment for Müller came not on a battlefield, but in the quiet hours of captivity, where small, seemingly insignificant actions would slowly unravel tightly wound beliefs that had held him prisoner in his own mind. It began in the modest setting of a British POW camp, where the tea had been the first unexpected gesture of humanity. But the true turning point came weeks later, when Müller and the other POWs were assigned to work details, specifically to a farm in Somerset. This was where the physical distance between captivity and normalcy began to blur. Müller, initially skeptical, had been assigned to muck stalls, repair fences, and haul hay bales. These were simple tasks, ones that required little more than physical labor. Yet, in the act of doing these tasks, Müller found something that defied his expectations, a sense of purpose. It wasn't just the work that was transformative. It was the way the farmer, Dalton, approached him. Dalton didn't treat him like a prisoner, but as a man who had something to offer. If Müller broke something, he fixed it. If he didn't do something right, he was given the opportunity to try again. There were no threats, no humiliation, just a silent understanding that work mattered. For the first time, Müller was treated as more than a soldier. He was seen as a human being. The culmination of this shift came one cold morning when Dalton handed Müller the keys to the tractor without a word of warning. The unspoken deal had been made. Trust had been earned. There were no guards watching over him as he plowed the field. Müller had expected a moment of tension, of fear. The temptation to escape was always present in the back of his mind. Yet, he found himself plowing the rows with care, not out of fear of punishment, but because it mattered to him. The work, his responsibility, and the respect that had been quietly built between him and Dalton transformed his sense of self. Müller didn't fully grasp the enormity of this change in himself until later. The realization that he had been trusted, not as a prisoner but as a man capable of responsibility, was something far more profound than any military victory. It was a psychological shift that opened his eyes to the fact that his captors, the British, were not just doing this for propaganda. They weren't looking for a quick victory over his spirit. They were, in a strange and unexpected way, offering him a chance to remain human. And it was in this moment that the war began to feel smaller, less like a global conflict, and more like a series of personal exchanges between individuals. Müller began to see his captors not as the enemy, but as individuals who had their own lives, their own duties, and their own desires. The farmer's wife, who had first placed a cup of tea on fence post with no expectation of gratitude, began to offer him biscuits. These small gestures, which would have been so easily overlooked by a man like Müller a few weeks earlier, now became symbols of something larger, a foundation of mutual respect that had never been possible before. The pivotal moment arrived when, in the depths of winter, the camp organized a Christmas Eve service. The event was optional, and at first Müller had little desire to participate. The war was still raging, and he had no reason to embrace the notion of goodwill between enemies. But something compelled him to attend. Perhaps it was the desire to experience something different from the confines of camp life. Or perhaps it was the quiet evolution in his own beliefs, which had been slowly shifting under the weight of these new experiences. The service, simple and brief, became an emotional turning point. The chaplain, with his thinning hair and mild manner, read from the Gospel of Luke, and a German POW played the accordion. The atmosphere was humble but charged with a quiet sincerity. Silent Night was sung in 2 languages, its harmonies clumsy but heartfelt. In that moment, the war, with its vast, unimaginable destruction, seemed to recede, leaving only human connection. For a fleeting instant, the lines between captor and captive, enemy and friend, dissolved in the shared humanity of the song. When the service ended, the guards, who had observed the event from the back of the hall, handed out cigarettes and extra tea. One young guard, barely 20 years old, stood at the back and clapped softly. Müller noticed this, but he didn't speak. There was no need for words. In that moment, there was a quiet recognition between the prisoners and the guards. The war felt smaller, and the distance between them, which had once seemed infinite, felt like it had been bridged, if only for a moment. It was this moment that would echo in Müller's mind for years to come. He would never forget how, in the face of everything he had been taught, he had found something else entirely. The possibility of human connection in the most unlikely of places. The culmination of Müller's shift in perspective came in the spring of 1945. The war, now clearly nearing its end, had taken a toll on both the Allies and the Axis powers. But for Müller, the days on the farm had become more than just an escape from the horrors of conflict. They had become a crucible for his understanding of himself, his captors, and the war that had shaped all their lives. By this point, the relationship between Müller and the British soldiers had evolved in ways he never expected. The unspoken understanding between him and Dalton, the farmer, had deepened. The work had become routine. Müller was trusted to tend to the tractor, to fix the fences, and to do his job without supervision. The rewards, though modest, were earned through effort. A bit of extra food for a hard day's work, or, more symbolically, a nod of approval from Dalton. But there was something else. Something more intangible, that had begun to grow between Müller and the British. It wasn't just that he had been treated with decency, though that was powerful in itself. It was that he had come to recognize the consistency of the British approach. They weren't perfect, but they were fair. They treated him not as a nameless enemy, but as a person, with his own agency. This was an idea that Müller had never been allowed to entertain before. In the midst of the brutality of war, it was easy to believe that human decency had no place on the battlefield. But the steady, methodical application of respect, from the medical officer to the farmer, from the camp guards to the prisoners themselves, had shown him otherwise. Then, one morning in late April 1945, as the first signs of victory began to flicker on the horizon, the British began to loosen restrictions. Guards no longer accompanied the prisoners to their work details. Müller and the other POWs walked unguarded through fields still wet with morning dew, their footsteps no longer monitored by armed sentries. It was an eerie shift, one that signaled the end of their captivity, not through force, but through the quiet recognition that the war was over, that their role as prisoners was coming to an end. That morning, Dalton handed Miller the keys to the tractor without a word. There was no supervision, no reminders, just a simple task: plow the north field. I'll check it later. There was no question of running away. There was nowhere to go. And besides, the trust Dalton had shown him had changed the equation entirely. Miller knew, on some deep, unspoken level, that to betray Dalton's trust would be an insult to the humanity that had been granted to him in this unlikely place. Miller plowed the field, his hands steady on the controls, his mind quiet. He had not only fixed the tractor, he had helped rebuild a sense of agency in himself. The rows were straight, the engine purred with efficiency, and when Dalton checked the work, he gave his quiet approval. "Good," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No fanfare, no grand speeches, just a simple recognition of a job well done. This was the pivot. For Miller, it was the moment he realized that the war and the ideology that had defined it had been a lie. He had come to this farm as an enemy, as a soldier who had been trained to fight, to kill, and to hate. And yet, here, in the most unlikely of places, he had been shown respect. He had been allowed to work, to live with dignity, and to experience the possibility of a different way. The propaganda had told him that surrender meant death, that the British were monsters. But Miller had learned the opposite, that in captivity, in the midst of a war, he could still be treated as a human being. It was a profound realization, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The enemy he had been taught to fear, to hate, had given him something far more valuable than a military victory. They had given him a lesson in humanity, and it was this lesson, this quiet and consistent application of principle, that would shape his understanding of the world long after the war had ended. Muller would go home in 1946, a changed man. Germany had collapsed, and the country he returned to was nothing like the one he had left. The propaganda had crumbled along with the Reich, but the lessons of his captivity, of mutual respect, of trust, and of the humanity shared between captor and captive, would endure. And for Muller, the war was no longer about the battlefield. It was about the quiet moments that had reshaped his soul. The war in Europe officially ended in May 1945 with the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. The chaos that had defined Europe for 6 long years slowly began to fade, replaced by the monumental task of rebuilding. The immediate aftermath of the war was a confusing time for the millions of soldiers who had been involved, and for the prisoners of war, it was a moment of uncertainty. For Müller, his time as a prisoner of war was not over as soon as Germany surrendered. As with many other POWs, repatriation would be a slow and difficult process. The logistics of transporting hundreds of thousands of men from Allied camps back to their countries were complicated, especially in the immediate post-war chaos. Many German POWs would remain in British custody for months, some as late as 1947, working in agricultural or reconstruction efforts before finally being sent home. In the case of Müller, he remained in the British camp until late 1946, continuing to work on Dalton's farm. The British, true to their word, had fulfilled their obligations to the Geneva Conventions, but they also maintained an unspoken understanding. For those who had proven themselves capable and trustworthy, the end of the war did not mean a return to the harshness they had been promised. Müller, having earned Dalton's trust, was not treated as just another prisoner. He was a man who had been shown respect and allowed to work. Even after the war's end, this mutual regard continued in small ways. Letters exchanged between Müller and Dalton, Christmas cards, updates on farm life, and small but meaningful gestures that reflected the enduring bond that had been forged in the fields of Somerset. For the British, the treatment of German POWs during the war had been more than just a military strategy. It had been a demonstration of values that would outlast the war itself. They had adhered to the Geneva Conventions not only because it was the right thing to do, but because it reflected the very principles they had fought for: the preservation of human dignity, the refusal to descend into the barbarity that had been the hallmark of the Nazi regime. This policy, which had been a fundamental part of their wartime effort, had tangible effects on the soldiers they had taken as prisoners. Men like Müller were not only spared the brutal conditions they had expected, they were given a chance to return to their countries with a radically altered worldview. The war had been an immense struggle, and for many, it had seemed that only the victors would emerge with any sense of dignity. But the British had managed to retain their principles even in the face of victory, showing the world that strength did not have to be measured by cruelty. It was a lesson that Müller, like so many other POWs, would carry with him long after the war had ended. As the years went on, the stories of the treatment of prisoners in British camps spread. For many Germans, the realization that their fears of Allied cruelty had been entirely unfounded began to chip away at the foundation of Nazi propaganda. German civilians, hearing from their relatives who had been in British captivity, began to question the official narrative. By the end of 1945, letters like Müller's, calm, factual, and devoid of hatred, had started to circulate, a quiet revolution in understanding. Some Germans, previously wary of surrender, began to realize that it was not the end, but rather a potential path to survival. Müller's own journey home was marked by the same quiet shift in perception. When he returned to his hometown in 1946, the world was no longer the place he had once believed it to be. Germany lay in ruins, its cities shattered, its economy in tatters. The propaganda machine that had fueled his hatred had fallen silent, replaced by the harsh realities of post-war life. The people who had lived under Nazi rule now faced the consequences of their actions. The country he returned to was a shadow of what it had been before the war, a place of despair and rebuilding. But for Müller, this was a moment of quiet reflection. His time in captivity had transformed him. He had gone in expecting to die, expecting brutality and suffering, but he had come out of it questioning everything he had been taught. Not through forceful indoctrination or the preaching of ideology, but through simple acts of decency and respect. The lessons he had learned in the British POW camps, about trust, about humanity, and about the power of restraint, stayed with him long after the war was over. As the post-war years unfolded, Müller found himself reflecting on the contrast between the world he had left behind in Germany and the one he had encountered in British captivity. The ideological framework he had been raised in, one that painted the Allies as brutal enemies and glorified the Nazi cause, had crumbled entirely during his time in Britain. The small acts of humanity, the respect he had received in British captivity, were far more powerful than any military victory or propaganda. They had reshaped him in ways that went far beyond the physical hardships of war. Returning to Germany in 1946, Müller was greeted with the ruins of a nation in disarray. The Third Reich, under which he had fought, had been shattered, leaving behind a country that was struggling to rebuild itself both physically and morally. The once proud nation was now divided, its economy in ruins, and its citizens grappling with the trauma of defeat. For Müller, this was not just the destruction of a state, but the collapse of an entire worldview. His hometown was no exception. Buildings had been reduced to rubble, and the streets that once held the promise of a future built on military conquest now seemed empty, haunted by the ghosts of the past. But what struck Müller most was the emotional desolation that lingered in the people around him. They too had been caught in the maelstrom of propaganda, sold a vision of glory that had turned to ashes. His fellow countrymen, much like himself, had been deceived, not only by the regime, but by the false assurances that had been built around their national identity. It was a sobering realization. The people of Germany, like the soldiers who had fought in its name, had been manipulated by a lie that could no longer be denied. For Müller, this wasn't just the end of the war, it was the end of an era. His return was marked not by a sense of triumph, but by the weight of personal and collective disillusionment. The values he had been taught to hold dear, those of duty, honor, and loyalty to the Führer, now seemed hollow, tarnished by the atrocities that had unfolded in the name of those ideals. Yet, in the midst of this disillusionment, Müller clung to the lessons he had learned during his captivity. Despite the devastation around him, despite the fractured landscape of his homeland, there remained a small, steadfast belief in the power of human decency. His time in Britain had shown him that, even in the darkest moments of war, it was possible to maintain one's humanity. This was not just a lesson for Germany, but for all of humanity, that restraint, decency, and the refusal to abandon one's principles could still have a place, even in the horrors of total war. Müller continued to stay in touch with Dalton, the farmer in Somerset. Their correspondence, though infrequent, became a symbol of the bond they had forged in captivity. Christmas cards and letters exchanged updates about family life, farming, and grandchildren. It was a connection that transcended the years of war and distance, one that demonstrated that mutual respect could grow even in the most unlikely of places. The fact that Miller could look back on his experiences with a sense of respect, not just for Dalton, but for the British soldiers who had treated him with dignity, was something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It was an understanding that, despite the war's cruelty and its brutal toll, the actions of a few individuals, like the British soldiers and officers who had adhered to international law, who had treated prisoners as human beings, could make all the difference. For Müller, the war had taught him to be skeptical of the narratives that had been fed to him and to see beyond the rhetoric of the propaganda machine. The lessons he had learned in British captivity would guide him for the rest of his life. They shaped not just his understanding of the war, but his broader worldview. The possibility of humanity, even in the face of overwhelming violence, had been shown to him in the simplest of ways. A cup of tea, a shared moment of silence, and the quiet dignity of being treated as a person, not an enemy. The story of Hans Müller and his experience in British captivity serves as a profound reminder of the power of restraint and decency, even in the most brutal of times. In the chaos of war, where the rules of civilization often break down, it is the quiet application of principle that distinguishes one side from the other. Müller, who entered British captivity with fear and hatred, ultimately left with a changed heart and mind. His experience shows that humanity, when allowed to flourish, can transcend the horrors of conflict. The war in Europe left behind not only a physical wreckage of cities and lives, but also an emotional and ideological wreckage. For Müller, the war had not been about an enemy to be defeated, but about the slow unraveling of everything he had been taught. His time in British captivity taught him that decency does not require victory to be validated, nor does it depend on the cruelty of an enemy. In the face of brutality, the British chose to treat him with respect, and in doing so, they not only dismantled the lies of Nazi propaganda, but they planted a seed of change that would grow for decades. Victory in war is often measured in terms of military gains, territory, or resources. But there is another kind of victory, one that is measured by the humanity that endures despite the conflict. Müller's story is a testament to the idea that even in the darkest moments, it is possible to hold on to something greater, a sense of self, a sense of decency, and a belief that human connection can survive even the worst of circumstances. His life after the war, marked by quiet correspondence with Dalton and his reflections on what he had learned, became a way to preserve the lessons of that difficult time. The bonds forged in war, while born of necessity, proved to be something deeper, a shared recognition that both sides were capable of greater things. For Müller, the message was clear. The greatest weapon the British had wasn't their might or their military strategies. It was their unwavering commitment to treating others with dignity, even in the midst of total destruction. And so, as the years passed, Müller would remember the tea, the warmth of the wool blanket, and the unexpected moments of humanity that had defined his captivity. These memories, simple yet profound, would shape his future in ways far greater than any battlefield victory. They would remind him, always, that civilization is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to uphold principles of decency and humanity, even when the world around us falls apart. The barbed wire came down. The cup remained.